I credit this one FBI agent, honestly, who was always with me, and we would drive down an hour down to the Silicon Valley from San Francisco. And he finally said, well, I think he may have included himself too, but he said, I think you're part of the problem because you went straight from law school into the public sector. And there are not enough people who really have been on both sides who can really understand that. And so that was my inspiration for leaving.
Welcome to Policy Catalyst. I'm Caroline Malcolm, and after my own transition from a long career in the public sector into a fast-growing tech company, I wanted to dig deeper into what it means to be an effective policy practitioner, but outside of government. So in these conversations, we're going to be sitting down with some of industry's foremost leaders on policy to unpack how they think about the function, the unique ways it can support a company's goals, and how they measure success. So now let's dive into today's conversation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to have the conversation.
Thank you. Candace, you are joining us from the West Coast, where you are the Chief Legal and Policy Officer for the Stellar Development Foundation. I wanted to dig in with you today about what it means to run a policy function at an organization like Stellar. But maybe before we get there, I want to touch a little bit on your own sort of personal path to this role. And first to take you back pre your professional career, maybe when you were still at school or early university, just to ask you, what was your very first job?
My very first job was being a lifeguard and a swim teacher and swim coach at local swim and tennis clubs. I did it many summers in my youth.
Okay. Well, that's not your ordinary, summer job. But probably like a fair amount of responsibility.
Indeed. I'm sure it led me directly to my current role.
From there, and well, maybe, yeah, exactly. What was that first step? Did you always knew you were going to be a legal and policy officer, or what was the path that actually brought you here?
I ended up going into law, and that was very much driven by when I was in college, doing a lot of kind of public service type roles and realizing that I wanted to be able to reach more people than the individual people that I could work with. There was one experience I had doing adult literacy, teaching adults to read and write, and I thought, well, this is really powerful, but how could I have a broader reach? And luckily, my college allowed me to create my own course for a term. And I did that and ended up doing that with this woman named Janet Reno, who was the state's attorney down in Florida. And she was the one who really inspired me to see how a career in law, and particularly in the public sector, could help me fulfill that goal.
When you graduated as a lawyer, what was your first job?
My first job out of law school was going back to work for Janet Reno. And at that point, she was the Attorney General of the United States.
Wow.
So it was good to stay in touch with the people that you meet along the way, because it was 5-6 years after I had done that, created that sort of internship project with her.
Interesting. Okay. And did you stay in touch with her throughout that time, or not really? And then you sort of reached out again?
No, I did. And it was a little nerve-wracking, because even as the state's attorney, she was kind of a big deal. When I left that intern, she had never done anything like that. She'd never had a college student work. It was always lawyers.
Okay.
And she said, never take a job without talking to me.
Okay.
She's the kind of person, when you haven't spent a lot of time with her, she never said things that she didn't mean. And so when I was leaving law school, I kept in touch. And when I got into law school and when I was going through law school, and obviously not in very close contact when she was the Attorney General of the United States, yes, but she was always incredibly generous with her guidance and her support. And it just worked out. The universe. She needed someone, and I was a good fit for that role, working on her staff.
Fantastic. And I think that is kind of the importance of sort of the people you work with, as well as the organizations you work for, I think is something which is sort of always rung true in my experience as well. So you go to work for the Attorney General. What sort of work were you doing, and where did that path lead you?
Well, my technical job was correspondent. I read everything she needed to read before she read it. She didn't have email access. I received all her emails. I received all the course. So anything from a kid writing a report on Janet Reno to the president of the United States to, should we have independent counsel or not? Everything, I was kind of the gatekeeper for that. And she had something called the Get Back meeting every morning. She had all the department heads come and meet with her, a representative from every department. It wasn't the top person, because she really believed in that cross-functional coordination, but she was very much a micromanager. So when I arrived, she had this list of, I think it was maybe 800 items that people had to get back to her on.
Wow.
And so by the end of my time, a couple of years later, it was down to about 70 because, slowly I taught her that she could trust us. And then others on her staff were also incredibly generous in allowing me, as a new lawyer, to get more engaged on some of the deeper legal issues. So I ended up being the liaison to the Civil Rights Division. So there was a lot of excessive use of force policy and work that was going on at that time. I remember we designed a program to make sure that if someone is a prosecutor and they are going to prosecute law enforcement for excessive use of force or use of a gun, that they've actually gone through that training themselves. So designed a program where they had to go to Quantico, which is where the FBI gets trained. And I went down and went through the training. So things really, really amazing and important and policy-related issues that I was working on for her.
That's incredible. Because I think those are still very topical issues today. Could you give a bit of a timestamp? What sort of era are we talking about that this is happening?
Oh, are you gracefully trying to it was it was the last 2 years of the Clinton administration, 1998 to 2000.
Okay. As I said, it's still very topical issues today. And I think that's sort of interesting because each era then also, encounters policy issues in a different political context. And that, of course, changes what you're able to achieve. I'm guessing it wasn't a straight line from there to where you are today. So could you take us a little bit through the steps?
Well, and I quickly, because as I just revealed, there are a lot of years in between. So I went out to the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco, where I had another amazing boss in Bob Mueller, who was the U.S. attorney here at the time. And I went through being a prosecutor from the smallest federal cases all the way over the course of 17 years, from immigration and guns and bank robberies to public corruption. And at the end, I was running the Special Prosecutions Unit, which was national security, public corruption, civil rights, environmental crimes. And in between, I went back for a couple of different stints in Washington in similar roles to the one that I had for Ms. Reno. I worked in the Deputy Attorney General's office at the beginning of the Obama administration. And then because Bob Mueller at that point was the FBI director and I was working on a lot of national security issues, we were in a lot of meetings together and he said, well, I do details too. So I went over and for counsel for national security for him for what was supposed to be the end of his 10-year term, but then it got extended. So I did kind of, unlike a lot of federal prosecutors, I bounced back and forth between actually running cases and running teams and doing the trials in court and the appeals to working at those higher offices in DC that kind of melded the policy and practical experience. And it was pretty interesting to go back after being right out of law school working for Janet Reno and then having a number of years under my belt as doing even less sophisticated cases. But it really was interesting to see how different my perspective was because there's so many incredible, brilliant people who take on those roles. And some of them were like me with very little practical, when I was in the AG's office, with little practical experience in the courtroom. And so kind of mixing that, people who'd been, maybe they'd clerked on the Supreme Court, but they hadn't done a trial themselves. And so really having that mix of experience was really interesting in my kind of perspective and realizing how important it is to have that mix in getting to the right outcome.
So that's interesting, right? Because it kind of ties back to something you said before, which is wanting to move from sort of having an impact at the sort of day-to-day level and then being able to 10x or X or more that impact by working on, say, the policy issues, but not being able to do that without having a very good understanding of how kind of the machine works in the day-to-day. How much longer did you stay in the public service after that? Was it a sort of a weak transition?
I was there. I was at DOJ for over 17 years. And then I realized after working particularly at the FBI and working on a lot of national security and then coming back and running national security for the Northern District of California, part of that role was not just running the cases and the investigations, but more public sector engagement. And particularly post the Snowden revelations, they're going down to Silicon Valley to name the company. We would go and talk about the cyber threat and say, we need to figure out how to have more information sharing. Of course, it's always a little bit more one way. Government doesn't share quite as much, but the lack of trust and the lack of really being able to convey the severity of the threat of nation state actors was so frustrating to me. I credit this one FBI agent, honestly, who was always with me, and we would drive down an hour down to the Silicon Valley from San Francisco. And he finally said, well, I think he may have included himself too, but he said, I think you're part of the problem because you went straight from law school into the public sector, and there are not enough people who really have been on both sides who can really understand that. And so that was my inspiration for leaving. I mean, it sounds very trite to say I left for national security reasons, but really I thought that closing that knowledge and trust gap was critically important for our national security. And so I went into the private sector, and I started at Uber, where I felt like they were at the time really interested in building a strong relationship with law enforcement, because if you put strangers in cars together, bad things are going to happen inevitably. So starting my idea and their idea was to start at that ground level and really engage at the beat cop level to show that a tech company can be helpful and can share information, and kind of build on that and leverage that into some more. As we now know, pretty much any major situation that you see, especially I'm in the US, so if you see a terrorist attack or you see any kind of tragic situation, a high percentage of the time, Uber has some sort of information that might be helpful. And people don't
may not be on most people's radars. Exactly. Like people think of Uber and think of national security, right?
Yeah. But it is kind of amazing. And I started down that path and really built a different mentality there of sharing threat information and proactively doing so. I remember being there after about a month or two. There was someone who went on a shooting spree in Kalamazoo, and it turned out he was an Uber driver, and no one would have been able to understand how and why he was in particular places over the course of a number of hours unless you saw the data of how he was getting different. And he wasn't killing his Uber passengers. He was picking up someone but that was why he was in a particular area. So recognizing that and the emergency situation, we engaged and shared that and made sure that they could understand how to interpret the GPS information. And so I was going down that path with Uber. Then, of course, a number of investigations and questions came up, and my job description shifted dramatically to being really running all of their government investigations, which was not why I left the government. So I did that. I kind of got them what I thought was a very good place. I hired my succession planning went into play, and then I looked for another opportunity where I could focus on what I really wanted to do, which was like that closing that knowledge and trust gap. And blockchain was not my first thought, but it through a series of circumstances and some people from our CEO and I went to law school together. So it was conversations that she was having in terms of coming to this organization, and I was looking for my next opportunity, and those conversations led to us working together now for over 5 years, almost 6 years.
That's fantastic. Again, and the importance of sort of keeping in touch, and you never quite know where that next thing will come from, but it can come from surprising places and lead you into surprising places. First, for those who don't know, Candace, tell us a little bit about Stellar. What type of business is it? Do you think of it as a business? What does Stellar do?
That's a good question. Do I think of it as a business? Stellar Development Foundation we are a non-profit, non-stock organization. We're not a charity. I didn't even know that existed before I came here. But we do not have a profit motive. So we are self-funded, which enables us to really focus our work on our mission, which is creating equitable access to the global financial system, and doing that through using the power of the blockchain and a specific blockchain network, the Stellar Network, which was launched in parallel with the foundation being created. So our work really revolves around catalyzing the growth of businesses building products and solutions on the blockchain. And I say businesses, but it can be anything from an individual developer all the way to a huge financial institution or government. So doing that through helping from a technical perspective, helping from funding perspective, we have grants, we do investments, and then also on the public policy front and education front, making sure that people understand what it is, what it isn't, how this particular blockchain is well suited for solving particular problems out in the world. And I think that's the thing that in the crypto space, we really try and distinguish ourselves and pride ourselves on the utility focus of what we do. Really trying, because of that mission that we have and because we have the luxury of not having to worry about the next round of funding and, getting returns on that, we're able to really focus on how can this technology help things like cross-border payments, things like helping people have access to everyday financial services, lending, borrowing, wealth generation. So those are the activities that we engage in.
Okay. And I mean, I'm familiar with the space, but I think for many people who aren't understanding sort of the challenges that exist in sort of cross-border payments and the work Stella is doing, I think is incredibly important in that regard. So we're not going to focus a huge amount on that, but if anyone's listening and does want to learn more, I encourage you to check out Stella. Candace, you're the Chief Legal and Policy Officer. Could you tell us a little bit about how that you oversee are organized?
And I'll start with saying that dual hat of legal and policy is something that was really important to me to have when I came here. I was in legal at Uber, and that policy was actually housed in the communications. It was government relations, policy, and communications, and legal was separate. Obviously, when I joined the Stellar Development Foundation, we had a very tiny team. I think there were about 20 of us, so we weren't going to have too many different departments. But to me, being able to have those two functions housed in one place was really important, particularly because of where the industry was in a very unregulated space and trying to advocate for those rules, and also being the lawyers who are trying to operate in that gray area and be able to see what's coming and kind of trying to operate in the way that we think the rules are going to be or should be. So to get back to your question, so I have a legal team that handles all the things that any in-house legal function would handle, from employment issues to contracts to all sorts of guidance that we give to our marketing folks, and product, because while we don't put user-facing products out into the world, we build tools for the open source tools for the ecosystem and for all of those developers and businesses to utilize in building their products and services that they put out to the public. And regulatory, as we support this ecosystem, so we are not a regulated entity. We don't own and control the network. It's an open public network. But making sure that we understand those rules and that we don't run afoul of that and start operating or doing things that should or could be regulated is important. And also being able to really understand how the folks who are seeking funding from us, seeking technical support from us, making sure we understand what their regulatory obligations are and are not, and being able to assess whether they understand that as well, because we're not going to control what they do. But if we don't have confidence that if you come to us and want some support, we want to make sure that you understand kind of what waters you're navigating. And then that the regulatory attorney is also kind of cross-functional in terms of supporting the government relations and policy side of the house. And I say those very specifically as two different things, particularly operating in the United States, where we have a very different level of engagement and lobbying in Congress and Capitol Hill than you do in a lot of the rest of the world. And so we've really tried to, in trial and error and tried to really distinguish those different functions, the policy, the substantive deep thinking of what the policy should be, and then separately kind of the engagement, the intelligence gathering from both the industry and governments, and the appropriate education, advocacy, and influence that is more on the government relations side.
That's a very, sort of thoughtful way, I think, to have designed the team. And as you say, a couple of factors going in there. I mean, the unique role that Stellar plays, or the Stellar Development Foundation plays, where the industry is at. And that's certainly kind of continued to evolve over the last 5 years. And also, I think that comparison to the way things were organized in Uber, where you mentioned you had the sort of communications, you had the policy over in the communications team. And I mean, I think the takeaway on that is that there is sort of no one right structure, but that there are these different structures, and being very thoughtful about how where you place these different parts of the house, including sort of regulatory affairs, which really does kind of bridge kind of the legal side and the obligations there, and the policy government affairs side is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that really understanding, as you've pointed out, kind of your role, right? Like Uber is a for-profit business and was competing with people who are very clearly competing. You have Lyft, you have Grab, you have others. It's a very different environment, and it was very different in terms of the way that Uber was disrupting the status quo. Crypto and blockchain are also disruptors, but it's in a very different way. And then on laying that on top of that, the Stellar Development Foundation, where we're a nonprofit and we are really supporting the growth and development of an entire ecosystem. And because of our strong commitment and belief in open source and interoperability, I end up being often talking about the industry writ large and making sure that, some of the positions that I advocate for wouldn't necessarily make the Stellar network the winner, because we don't believe that that's how the end game should be, right? There should be one takes all, that interoperability really is a driver of innovation, of competition. And if you're really concerned about the end user and access and making sure that people have access, that competition and innovation is really critical. That's the status quo we are trying to disrupt, is that concentration of power in small number of entities. So it's a very different mindset and strategy.
Yeah. What does it actually look like day to day to be doing your job? I would say sort of literally sort of a day in the life, but maybe a week in the life, because I know you have travel and, all these different sorts of things going on, different types of meetings. But what does it actually look like to be someone running sort of legal and policy at a place like Stellar?
Well, no 2 days are the same, and predictability is not very high on my my agenda. I am very fortunate to have an incredibly strong team on both sides. The legal team is very self-sufficient and mature, and they are very good at making sure that they know when and how to escalate things. So I would say at this stage, this hasn't always been true in my time here, but at this stage, I spend less of my time on that side because I have such strong partners there, folks on my team, and they work so well amongst each other and with the business, which is not always true in legal. So we've worked really hard to make sure that that's the case. And then on the policy and government relations side, I think it's so dynamic, and it's particularly right now in the United States, there's moment to moment, there's a lot of try and distill and to make sure that we are staying focused on what matters to the Stellar ecosystem and to the parts of the blockchain and crypto industry that we care about. Much more dependent on, we have a very small team, and we're much more dependent on information and intelligence gathering from outside, whether it's trade associations and outside consultants. And so trying to just consume all of that and then be able to distill it and figure out what are the key things that we care about, and where and how can we have the most influence on that, and how do we stay very consistent both externally but also internally. I think people sometimes allow the policy and GR function to get a little bit siloed. And we certainly have been guilty of that at different phases over my time here, but making sure that there is that constant feedback loop, right? And so not just sort of reporting out, but thinking about, here are some policy issues that are on the roadmap and that are coming down the pike. So let's make sure that we're talking to the product team. Let's make sure we're talking to the business teams, and that we're anticipating that and really understanding the technology, because that is the key, right? If you're trying to close a knowledge and trust gap, we have to be the technology experts. No one else is going to understand the technology better than the people who built it and are running it, and who are engaging with the ecosystem of people who are building on it. And so I think that's the other piece, is making sure that we don't get too externally focused and diverge from the reality that's happening in the space, because the technology does move and change so quickly that you easily can have stale talking points, for lack of a better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's incredible the degree of innovation that happens in this space. You mentioned a couple of things there I want to double click on. So perhaps just to take them one at a time though. You mentioned sort of external consultants. How do you make the decision about what stays external and what you bring in-house? And is it to do with the type of role they're playing? Is it about, well, we need someone to do that, but it's not a full-time role? Or is it there are some functions that you simply want always external for a variety of reasons?
I think with respect to the trade associations, there are some times when it is beneficial to have that distance. So it's not an individual company advocating for something, and that they can speak on behalf of the industry. And so we can kind of give input and let them make those arguments. With respect to the consultants, I think to me, that's just a matter of bandwidth and proximity, right? So we have folks in the UK, EU, in Asia. I don't have team members in those locations. So getting that expertise and being able to interpret things is really important. I obviously have some folks in DC who can do some of that, but even so, just the volume and being able to have people to pressure test some of our ideas and our strategies is really important. But I think particularly when I think about DC, it's really important to me, and it's been important for our CEO, Danelle, from the beginning. I mean, we hired someone just one person who had both the government relations and policy hat, probably within the first 40 people that the foundation hired. So that was really important to make sure that we have this really credible voice and strong voice, and that it's unique to us and to the Stellar Foundation. Particularly when you look across the industry, there's just so much variety, and there's the noise has often been on the trading and speculative use cases. And so we really believe that if the utility of this technology is going to shine through, we have to have a very strong voice. So you can have as many external consultants, and they can all get very excited about various different pieces that you tell them about in use cases. There's nothing that, if you live it and breathe it all day, every day, you can't beat that from, I go back to, when I was a prosecutor, and particularly going into to make arguments in the appellate court. So you have three very wise judges who grill you, and some guidance that I received was they're never going to know the facts. They will know the law better than you will, probably, no matter how hard you prepare, but they will never know the facts better. And that's it. You have to marry the two to get to the right outcome. And I'm going to take that the same.
Good analogy. Yeah. You also mentioned the sheer volume of activity in this space. I mean, there's particularly a lot at the time we're recording this, but in general, it's a very fast-moving space. Do you have any daily practices, like things that you do kind of to stay on top of what is like you're checking the news every day? Is that you have a daily brief with your team? What is that sort of, how do you stay on top of the volume?
Sometimes I don't.
Fair. Yeah.
I try and find the sources that I find to be the most credible and check those on a daily basis. Some of those come from our external consultants. Some of them are from news outlets. I personally do not spend a lot of time on Twitter. I know in this space, it is probably one of the best sources if you have enough time and if you have the kind of patience to sift through the signals and the noise. And so again, I'm very fortunate to have a great team of people who, many of them do a little bit more of that and curate that a bit for me, because it's just not something that I have the right fortitude to navigate. So I'm very appreciative of my team for helping me make sure that, and honestly, some of the best news sources will link to, the most relevant tweets and things.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, we need a Twitter aggregator, effectively.
Yeah.
You mentioned the product team. Who else do you think of in terms of internal stakeholders for the policy team and GR team in particular?
The BD, the business development team, which, as I explained, business development for us is going out and finding folks that we're giving grants to, that we're making investments in, partnerships. We sometimes call them partnerships, but making sure that we're staying abreast of what they are focused on, and to ensure that we are focusing on the right issues for the ecosystem, and making sure that they are giving us feedback as well. If you think of like tokenization. It's supposed the business and the engineering teams get involved in those. Sometimes they're tools. I remember, this is dating myself, but way back when there was a company called Securrency, and they were trying to help tokenize securities, and they came and said, you need clawback functionality. And so working together, we created those tools and open sourced them. So, and then also our marketing and communications team, because so much of what, you can have the greatest, smartest ideas, but if you don't get them out and get them out in the right channels, and sometimes that's one-on-one meetings with policymakers and lawmakers, but it needs to be broader than that. And that's something that my team and the communications team has really helped me to learn more about. I think coming from being a prosecutor, where your voice is your briefs and what you say in court, that kind of that evolution for me has been probably painful for my comms team to plumb. But it really is very true that if you want to have a credible and influential voice, you have to have more stakeholders and more people who are looking to see what your team and your organization stands for, and how we talk about things in a lot of different channels, not just
exactly. But that also brings up something I think which is quite interesting, which is this concept. And I know you and your team, as well as Danelle, CEO, do a lot of public facing work. How do you think about that distinction between the sort of personal brand and the company or the foundation brand?
And I think that's part of the journey that I was because it is very different, right? And I think I've gone on that journey of separating that a little bit. I think it was a little too inextricably intertwined as a prosecutor. That was my job. That was my identity. And I think that in order to advocate on behalf of an industry and behalf of an ecosystem, sometimes there has to be a little bit more of a distinction. But certainly, if you look at Danelle, she has a very strong, and her reach is so broad because she shows up publicly in not just the public policy channels, but also in the business sense as well. And she built that through many years of her work on the Web 2 side of the house at Mozilla and other places.
When you're hiring people, and when you're then at the sort of next performance review stage, what do you tell people is the purpose of the policy function or the the government relations function, and how people know if they're successful in it?
It's when you work in an organization with engineers who have very, very clear metrics. That's
all sales teams.
Yes, and sales. How many deals did you do, and how many? It's a much squishier proposition. But I think that, if you think of the functions as education, influence, advocacy, branding, then as we've gotten more sophisticated, there are actually some metrics that you can pull with respect to, are people coming and visiting our policy hub? Are people looking at the things that we put out? And then so that's on the kind of media side. Are people reaching out and asking for us to attend, whether it's substantive roundtables or very just public speaking events? And then are people sending us bills that they want us to mark up and say, okay, don't tell anybody. We'd like your opinion.
That relationship with trust.
Yes, when you see those comments and edits and changes in the next draft of the bill or in the final draft of the bill and those types of things. So a lot of it is that quiet. And this is, I think, for us, much more U.S. centric, but that those calls and the asking Danelle or me to come and testify. So I think there are all of these external factors that you can weigh in terms of whether or not you are achieving that ad and influence, if people are listening and then seeking out
and how do you actually sort of capture that? Is it a very manual process, or have you automated it somehow that you're able to kind of get a sense of those different
metrics? It was some automated thing. I could just push a button and say, here's the answer. No, it is manual. It is soft skills. It is so, and part of it you can say, like, how many written pieces did you put out into the world? How many, that kind of thing is a factor. But if you put out 100 things and nobody reads them, it doesn't matter. If you put out one and people take that piece and turn it into legislation, that's the other extreme. And so it's not a science, it's an art of trying to figure that out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was hoping you might have some big reveal of a tool that we're all been waiting for, but it doesn't sound like we're quite there yet. And then, like, coming back to those sorts of like what makes, policy function successful when you're hiring, how do you think about, I guess, a couple of things? One is people's like governmental experience. Do you think that's a necessary element? And secondly, technical expertise. How important is that? Sort of on the actual, as you kind of alluded to before, the sort of knowing the technology. How important is that for you when you think about, what will make someone successful?
I think that they're both important, but no one thing is sort of a deal breaker, right? Because everyone comes with a mix of those skills or lack of those skills, and it's having the capacity, the curiosity to engage in those. So particularly on the technical side, I would say I didn't come with a lot of technical experience, but I came with a lot of experience as a prosecutor, being in a variety of different units. You're never an expert in whatever the next case is, and you learn how to become that, right? You learn how to take something that can be very, very complicated and learn from those experts to distill it into a way that, in that case, a jury can understand it. So
That
I
translation
understand it well enough to be able to explain it. So I think that those types of skills and the interest in being able to do that is more important than finding someone who understands blockchain and crypto, because the reality is that the role is to be that bridge. So I also have engineers who I call my bridge people. I can ask them anything and they can meet me where I am and then up level me. So then the next time I come, I'm a little bit closer. It's a little easier for them. But I think those are really important. And same with the government experience. I think, it's not mandatory. It certainly helps to have understood what it's like and what the role of the government folks is. But I think as long as someone has been in a role where they've had that interaction, I'm trying to think if I hired anyone on the government relations and policy side who didn't have government. I think everyone's had at least some.
a little bit of government.
Very different, some on the legislative side, some in a enforcement agency, some in Treasury. So
yeah, I mean, government's not monolithic either, right? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So my experience working at DOJ is so different from anyone who's been working on Capitol Hill, but both, it does help. But again, I don't think that it's, I think Danelle is very effective in this space, and I think she interned on the Hill for a little while. So I think anything, it's really being able to probe whether people have the capacity to understand the role that the person they're trying to influence has, right? And to meet them where they are, as opposed to just saying like, I understand my stuff and I'm an expert and let me tell you. It's really understanding what is that gap? There is a gap. Every conversation, we have a gap. You're asking questions and I'm trying to fill that gap. And so I think that is what I look for, is people who understand that is the role, and that definitely are going to draw from their experiences and closing gaps in different contexts. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that they came from government or they, yeah.
No, I like that idea of sort of meeting people where they are. I think it's sometimes easy to forget, particularly in a fast-moving tech space, to be sort of get caught up in sort of the latest tech development, but not kind of understanding where your audience is starting the conversation. Yeah. Candace, I know we're closing in on the end of our time. I wanted to ask you two more questions. One is about AI, because it wouldn't be an interview in 2025 without a question. I guess a lot of people think of it as a productivity tool. There can be a lot of writing, a lot of development of talking points when you're in policy type roles. How are you thinking about the use of it in the function at Stellar?
I think at this point it's sort of like a starting place, or checking to make sure, it's sort of when I think back to like when I did legal research with no AI tools. And once you got to the point where you just kept seeing the same thing, you kind of felt like, all right, I think I've exhausted my research. So certainly something that we use quite cautiously, but really to be more efficient and make sure that we're kind of not missing something. But yeah, so it's not, I wouldn't say we're leaning in very heavily in the AI space. More broadly, I think that what I'm excited about is kind of the uses of AI in the broader blockchain space and trying to figure out how that can improve efficiencies, and especially in compliance and detecting fraud and things like that. And there's still work to be done on, privacy and data and things like that. I think that to me is a really exciting potential out there. And
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, both potential and risk, particularly on the crime side. And I have great hopes for it in that regard on the UX side, where I think a lot of the UX in this space can sometimes leave a bit to be desired. In closing out, Candace, any final hot tips of things that you think were really instrumental in your career, things that you did or things that you experienced or things that you saw that, really helped kind of make the difference in your ability to be successful?
I think maybe I've touched on this and you kind of pointed it out, but I think maintaining my relationships with people along the way and recognizing that your career does build on itself and the different things that you've done. And I know that I've had not the most traditional path to where I am. And so I get the question all the time, like, how'd you go from being a national security prosecutor to this, right? But and it's not even maintained it's a very organic way that I maintain those relationships. And so they're really, just recently I've like reconnected with some folks who I worked with in the U.S. Attorney's Office and at the FBI, and just engaging with them and talking about what we're doing in more of a social way. It still reminds you of kind of the experiences that you had and the principles that you kind of have developed over time. It's really all your experiences come down to the people that you worked with, right? Like I can talk about all these really cool, interesting cases that I worked on and what I learned from them, but really I learned from the people and how people interact and the diversity of people that you interact with. And I think that public policy, it's essential that you don't get too caught up in like, what is the technology and how is this technology showing up in the world, and how are all these different people interacting and reacting to it, right? So you have the people who are trying to set policy and trying to make sure that things are safe for consumers and still allow for innovation. You have users who, in our case, we care about the folks who don't have access to the financial system, and everyone along that chain. So I think that that's another piece of it, is just always trying to remember both the people that you've worked with and the people that you're trying to serve, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. We're all trying to improve the lives of people. And so I think being able to stay connected to the folks that I've worked with along the way in any capacity just kind of helps me to continue to remind myself of those lessons that I've learned and how they apply to my current role.
Candace, that is such a meaningful note to end on. Thank you so much for bringing out the sort of human side. It's not sort of tech progress for tech progress sake. We're actually trying to make an impact on people's lives. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to hopefully speaking to you again before too long.
I hope so. Thank you so much. This was really fun.